drum roll. Thank you. Oh, lovely drum roll. The envelope, please. The winner of the long-sought lactose contest is Darylyn Dury's Tuesday 1:15 section. This time, tomorrow, 1 week from tomorrow, you guys will have a cheese tasting event in section, unless you'd like to propose an evening, and I'm amenable to either one. Gosh, is that light bright. I can't get out of it either. Thank you. Oh, that's better. Now I can see people. Congratulations. The schemas were wonderful, terrific, and we will post them in, we haven't worked it out yet, but maybe the TA room upstairs, maybe downstairs in the Humbio office for everybody to see. They came in various size, shapes, and colors. One group forgot that we asked 8.5 by 11, but we still counted it because we could have reduced it to fit. They were, I mean, it has even fewer words than this entry, for example. They were all terrific, and I appreciate all the hard work that went into them. You will see, I think, after studying it for a few minutes in the hallway, why the Tuesday 1:15 Darylyn Dury section was chosen as the winner. And it integrates all aspects of it and does so in a way that I think makes the whole interpretable as well as each of the parts. A number of them emphasized one aspect or another, and this was the one that seemed to give the best treatment overall to the scheme. It's quite a nice rendition, so I encourage you all to take a look at it. I must say I was pleased when a number of people after class on Friday said, they really felt they had understood the lactose case until they started to diagram it and realized how very complicated the interaction of genetics and culture in that case is. So I hope you agree with me that it was a worthwhile effort for all of us, even if the spoils go to the Tuesday 1:15 section. Okay. How did the incest taboo reading treat you? Did you find my manuscript at least coherent, or at least possible to get through? It is a bit long. You'll be pleased to know that my editor has reduced it to 2/3 the length that you saw since I last had it. I'm sorry I couldn't get you it would just be slashed all over the place. You wouldn't be able to read it at all. Did it make sense? Okay. What I'd like to do today is simply, very difficult to understand some charts and graphs. Can you be more specific about any particular one? We've been through about half of them here together. All the genetics of inbreeding. We've been through the part that we haven't gone through. And in fact, I guess it's fair to say because of changes in Wolff's argument this year, we no longer need to, is the refutation of Westermarck's hypothesis of how you extend the aversion to the incest taboo. Westermarck argued that the taboo should correlate with the closeness of childhood experience. And the good part of the last half of that reading is a statistical test which shows you that there is no such correlation, that the correlation works the other way around. That the correlation is governed more by concern over protecting against inbreeding and its damaging effects to successful reproduction than it is by to whom you feel averse. What I think might be useful to do on particular ones is bring the questions either to me here in the lecture or in sections or both, and we can talk about it. I'm sorry, I think some of the Xeroxing was bad on some of the tables and stuff. It made it kind of hard to read. If you could be more specific, though, I could be more helpful. Okay. Other questions or concerns about the reading? Let me just then make a few points. Again, it's nice that we no longer have to debate Westermarck's formulation. I guess my answer this morning to Arthur is, now who's changed his position on the subject? But let me remind you that, in fact, it was a young man, Arthur Wolff, in 1966, who wrote, "The fact that intimate childhood association creates an aversion to sexual relations in marriage does not explain the incest taboo." I fully agree with that young man. I think he was right. In his first paper on the subject. Now, let us turn to Wolff's criticism of the Burton and Durham theory. I have actually modified the Burton theory in a number of ways, as you've noticed. I no longer refer to it as an inbreeding theory, but an optimal outbreeding theory. We can go over that if you have questions about it. But I wanted to talk about how Westermarck discarded the idea of inbreeding depression, of the deleterious effects of inbreeding, and go through his argument, first to show that it's very similar to Wolff's, and second to show that he had the answers to, that he answered the argument himself. Westermarck said that unions between the nearest of relatives are, as a rule, followed by injurious consequences. This is extremely probable, as we shall soon see in a list that he goes through telling you about the injurious consequences between nearest relatives. But it is another question whether the harmful consequences have been observed by the savages who have prohibited such unions. Such knowledge could be gained only by lengthened observation beyond the capacity of the savage mind. So the idea is that our human brothers and sisters, the Kuna, the Chinese in Taiwan, people all over, these are the savages whose minds somehow don't have the capability that we have to notice that inbreeding has deleterious effects. I found an even worse example in Leslie White, an anthropologist writing in 1948. But suppose inbreeding did produce inferior offspring. Are we to suppose that ignorant, magic-ridden savages like the Kuna could have established this correlation without rather refined statistical techniques? I mean, this morning Arthur made the comment that you got to have a PC to figure this out. The Kuna don't have a PC. All the people around the world who've noticed, many of whom you've read about now, have noticed these things without PCs plugged into the wall. Continues Westermarck. But even if savage men everywhere had discovered that children born of marriage between closely related persons are not so sound and vigorous as others, we would certainly not be sure that they everywhere would have allowed this knowledge to check their passions. Now, this morning Wolf made 3 points. Would they have noticed? Would they be motivated to do something about it? And could they self-consciously legislate or the rule to stop this kind of thing? Well, you know, my view on all of this is let's let the natives tell us what they do. Let's let people around the world. Let's not go in expecting to find magic-ridden, ignorant savages. Let's go ask people what they notice. And let's start by using the documentation Westermarck, who gives us some of the very best examples. He says, yet we are told of uncivilized people who ascribe evil results to close intermarriages. Now look what we have here. We have folk theories for why there's an incest prohibition. In a Greenland Eskimo tale, the father of Kakamale, finding that all his grandchildren have died before reaching the age of puberty, suggests to his son-in-law, perhaps we are too near akin. Well, this is in a tale, and it just says, well, perhaps this is wrong that we're having sex with near relatives. That's just his first example. He immediately continues with his sentence. The Dieri, the Lake Eyre Basin of Australia, according to Mr. Gayson, have a tradition that after the creation, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, and others of the closest kin intermarried promiscuously until the bad effects of these marriages became manifest. They noticed, they recognized. A council of chiefs was then assembled. Okay, they're motivated. A council of chiefs was then assembled to consider in what way the evil might be averted. Motivated to avert that problem. And the result of their deliberations was a petition to Muramura, the good spirit. In answer to this, Muramura ordered that the tribe should be divided into different branches and distinguished one from the other by different names, after objects animate and inanimate, such as dogs, mice, emu, rain, and so forth, and that the members of any such branch should be forbidden to marry other members of the same branch. The legislation in this case came from on high, came from the same source as the punishment. You simply, you know, through the logic of understanding their religious system, they simply came to understand that in order to prevent this, there was a deliberate effort had to be made to avoid marrying those who were closely related. So I submit to you, in Westermarck's very own examples, we have the answer to the question, do they notice? Are they motivated? And do they self-consciously legislate? Let me give you a few more examples just to show you this is not an isolated event from Westermarck. On the same pages, he continues. The Achewa, a Nyanja-speaking tribe in the Nyasa Land Protectorate, have a very similar legend about the origin of the exogamy of their totemic clans. It's called a totemic clan. When you have that association, you're the deer or the emu or the rain, and you therefore must not marry or have sex with someone of the same named group. Formerly, they say, all their people bore the name of Piri, until their chieftainess, Nyangu, called them all together, and, in order to prevent the evils of close intermarrying, gave each family a new name, which was to descend to the children and to the children's children. Okay, so again, we're told that here's a place to prevent the evils of close intermarrying. They devised a system of name differences which would reduce that problem. The Fanti, continues Westermarck, the Gokul, you get the point. I mean, again, the point is not to remember any of these particular quotes, but to get the message that people do recognize. People are motivated, and they are fully capable of legislating the rules to reduce that behavior. The Fanti of the Gold Coast, again, attribute to the institution of their exogamous totem clans to a wise seer of old, and they are said to consider the practice of exogamy of the greatest benefit for the improvement of the species, whereas the children of parents who belong to the same totem clan are believed not to live long. All of these are from Westermarck. At the same time as he was trying to propose this alternative theory, you see, Westermarck wanted us to accept this as evidence for the deleterious effects of inbreeding, but throw it out as magic and superstition-laden belief. He wanted to throw it out as reflecting anything having to do with the incest taboo itself. So let me show you some examples that are not from Westermarck, ones that I just have picked up and particularly like, ones that you didn't read. Just to show you that on all continents, at all times and places, observed by all peoples, the Jivaro, a group in Ecuador whom I have visited, the Jivaros are firmly convinced that children who are born deformed or defective in any way have been begotten by a demoniacal operation. Such a child is called Netsi Pasuna, deformed, monstrous, or Iguanichi Yuchi, the son of a demon. Most generally, this follows as the consequence of unlawful marriage, especially a marriage within the forbidden degrees of relationship, when brother and sister or cousins on the male side marry, or when a man marries his niece or a woman her nephew. Such marriages are therefore looked upon with horror and strictly forbidden by Jivaro custom. Well, this was written in 1935 by an anthropologist who was visiting there. It's certainly well before genetic theories of the incest taboo had gained much ground, and certainly at a time when anthropology was dead set against the view that the genetic experience of human populations has anything to do with their cultural, the formulation of cultural rules and regulations. So I think we can accept this as a pretty good example. Again, the natives tell you that the reason they look upon with horror and strictly prohibit is because of the deleterious inbreeding effects. One final example, one that was in the reading, just to hit a highlight of it, which brings us back in a sense to the Kuna. One of my favorite examples that came out of our attempt to generate a random sample and to study this, we came upon a population in this world probability sample called 60 cultures, a group living in the Celebes island called the Toraja. And the Toraja are interesting because they have high frequencies of albinism, not as high as the Kuna, but again, albinism is linked to inbreeding. And here's what they say. Now, this is not ascribing it to the supernatural. This is simply saying, look, this is a very common, this is a very practical matter. There's an incompatibility of substance. The Toraja say it can happen that a man and woman have physical characteristics that come into conflict with each other when they marry. The harmful influence of this will manifest itself in the children born from such a marriage. They will be weak, sickly, or idiotic, and quickly die. Therefore, a marriage with a person too closely related, a marriage with a person too closely related is considered unsuitable, literally, not corresponding in physical characteristics. Their children are not healthy and do not live long. So what kinds of unhealthy characteristics do you find? Well, you'll still find unhealthy characteristics. As Wolf pointed out this morning, in any inbreeding population, there's going to always be some level of cleft palates, hair-lipped, albinism. I didn't show you the hair-lipped and cleft palates in San Blas, but they're there, and the Kuna talk about them. Albinism is there. The thing is that people realize that economic circumstances impose on them greater sanctions, that they live in these endogamous communities, inbreeding communities, to avoid the economic hardship of marrying out. So that means there will be some albinism, but within those communities they regulate strenuously the close intermarrying to reduce the frequencies as best they can. So here's what the Torajans say. There are many stories about men and women who supposedly married a tree spirit. There are women who say they are visited every night by one of these spirits. Many become pregnant from such intercourse. Some of the children who are said to result from a marriage with a spirit are described as light of skin with blue eyes and white hair. This refers to albino children. So-called spirit children do not live long. You see how they interpret this? Because their fathers take them in order to bring them up. The spirits take them to bring them up. So they don't live long in this world. They're taken away. So the Torajans have an explanation for albinism. It's a conception by a spirit. But what do the Torajans really say about this? More than one Toraja chief assured us that women claimed to have been made pregnant by a tree spirit when their condition was the result of intercourse with a member of her kin group with whom she was not permitted to marry. People thus have recourse to this phenomenon in cases where incest has been committed. So the point is here, not only do they recognize the deleterious effects of inbreeding, they have an alibi and they recognize that it's an alibi. Okay? So what I'm simply trying to emphasize here this morning is simply the empirical basis, the empirical confirmation, I think, of a view that the incest taboo is motivated, based upon, and legislated in response to the deleterious effects of inbreeding. The only further comment I would make is that, and may clear up some trouble in the reading, when you define inbreeding depression as really the reduced fitness as a consequence of inbreeding, you can't just study the genetic effects. All kinds of things can contribute to the reduced fitness of inbred parents, of inbreeding parents. And among those things, a point that brings Wolf's perspective a bit closer to the one that I think is correct, is the fact that there can be psychological effects. Wolf mentioned this morning that the psychological effects on women are tough, and that the women may have created this taboo in response to that. Well, if you recognize the psychological effects, if you recognize the aversive effects, that is to say the disinterested and the reduction of fertility as a consequence of that, lump all of those deleterious fitness-reducing consequences together and call those inbreeding effects. You see, if there's been a problem in the genetic theory, it's because the focus was too narrow on the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Inbreeding can have psychological effects. Inbreeding can have aversive effects by the fact of the two people being childhood associates and being, having lower fertility. The result, therefore, is that we shouldn't simply take the genetic side of inbreeding effects as the full consequence. So my concluding comment would be simply this. I believe the change this year, I think we're finished with slides, so let me get that light out of my... We do want to have a discussion this morning, and so to kick that off, let me be provocative and say that I think the change in Wolf's position this year has weakened his argument. What is the difference now? Let me make 2 points. The first point is, what is the difference now between saying the taboo is a female formulation to protect themselves, which is what he said at the end, one of the 2 options he gave at the end of last hour. What's the difference between saying that a taboo is a female formulation to protect themselves and that taboo is an adult human formulation to protect themselves from deleterious effects? It seems to me the cognitive acts and the legislative capability and all those things that Wolf wanted to use to criticize my theory are entirely included within his own. By saying that taboo is a female formulation to protect themselves, he simply focused in on a problem for the women as opposed to what I would argue is a problem for all humankind, the deleterious effects of inbreeding, all those effects. And there's very little difference between saying a taboo is a female formulation to protect themselves and a taboo is an adult formulation to protect themselves from deleterious effects. I think the latter is a broader, more generic term and doesn't require the very specific legislative ability that the female formulation would require. The second argument that I would now have with Wolf's position is we have absolutely no positive evidence. We have absolutely no positive evidence of females sitting down and creating an incest taboo to protect themselves. We have no positive evidence for males struck by the dissonance between their attraction to their sisters and the sisters' rebuffing of their advances. We have absolutely no evidence that this has historically and repeatedly in all the human societies of the world. It's not enough to talk about the statistics in China. We need comparative evidence from other peoples in the world. We have no positive evidence to show us that this has in fact occurred. And I think those are 2 very critical changes in Wolf's theory that frankly I think weaken the proposition. And I now invite him to comment on that. And I invite you to raise your questions for both of us.
Why don't we let people ask questions?
Can everybody hear? I will repeat questions as you ask them. This is part of one of our institutions in human biology. When it says discussion, we do discuss. We usually and invite your participation. So please go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask why is there lower inbreeding depression rather than higher in small populations?
In small populations, you can, because of some genetics that we're going to talk about in about a week's time, in small populations there will be a general elevation in global inbreeding. That is to say, the likelihood of an independent homozygosity is increased in small populations. Independent homozygosity, the creation of, in a homozygote state, of deleterious alleles from not closely related parents, exposes those deleterious alleles to natural selection, and that the frequency can thereby be lowered. So in small populations, you expect natural selection to cleanse a population quite quickly. One of the reasons the Kuna Project is so interesting is that Kuna live in small, endogamous islands where you expect characteristics like albinism to be rather harshly and quickly selected against. It's in large populations where natural selection will not so commonly encounter, will not so often act on independent homozygotes, because there aren't so many, that you expect to see little n increase through time.
So you would imagine like those blue people of Troublesome Creek and in small populations, if those were really deleterious for survival, that would disappear.
Would have disappeared. We wouldn't even be talking about the blue people if in fact it had resulted in the inability of that blood to carry oxygen, period. You know, that would have happened as one family, one event, and be gone. Mm-hmm. You had a question.
Oh, yes. I was going to ask Professor Wolf, and maybe eventually you would add on to this. If the incest taboo is primarily a female aversion, how has that throughout history generally manifested itself in the rules, the strong cultural rules and regulations and legislation we have against incest? How has that swayed from females not liking incest to it? We have rules against it.
Everybody hear the question?
What I'm implying, I guess, is that many rules and legislations are created by males in society. So how has this female aversion swayed over to cause some action?
Well, I don't see how I can answer it other than what, in some ways, I've said already. I've offered you two possibilities. Maybe one of the things that helps in your thinking about it is that hunting and gathering societies are much more egalitarian than peasant and modern societies. So if you look like people like the Kung Bushmen and so forth, I don't think we have any society in which you can say that is a matriarchy, in the sense that females are dominant over males, but we do have, particularly in the hunting and gathering societies, which are the best examples we have for what conditions might have been at an early prehistoric time, a situation in which was most clearly manifested and so forth in contribution to subsistence, in which women's contribution to subsistence and the support of the group is much larger than that of the males. And you have then a very different kind of, relationship between the sexes than you do at the other extreme in a place like China. I think under those conditions, that a female inhibition and a female aversion is much more likely to be expressed in, rules and regulations in the society than it would if we started with strongly patriarchal societies, but we didn't. Those only developed later in human history, as best we can say.
Let me be a devil's advocate here for a second. One of the challenges to a theory like this is to see if it applies to our own society and the history of our own incest regulations. And one of the things I've always been interested in is when you go back and look at the Roman Catholic prohibition. Where did it come from? And Pope Gregory the Great told a number of apostles or a number of religious authorities in general when they asked, following the Roman period of Christianity back in really I guess about 600 or 800 AD, said that we have learned from the experience in the Roman Empire that there is no issue to the marriage of first cousins, and that the church therefore forbids this. Well, if you then follow what happened in the Catholic Church through time, so you have Pope Gregory, who is a male authority, pronouncing that the church prohibits this because out of human experience we now see that there is no successful issue, or there are commonly no successful issues to first cousin matings. Then watch how the church changed that rule through time. There's a social analyst, anthropologist named Jack Goody who has studied the history of the incest taboo in Western Europe and just simply shows that as the church needed land for economic revenue, they expanded the incest prohibition. So first, Pope Gregory opened the door by saying first cousins are prohibited by practical experience. The next thing you know, second cousins. Then second cousins once removed, then third cousins, and so on. The church expanded. And it was all basically an imposed legislation by the church, primarily a male institution at that time, to take land as parents died and as to intervene in the marriage process to prevent the successful inheritance, so that the church got more and more access to European land. It's not my argument, it's Jack Goody's argument, but to me it shows a couple of things. It shows males making the decisions, it shows the flexibility in our own incest taboo, and it shows that the taboo is manipulated. Authorities impose changing definitions on the incest taboo, but that it originated in a more or less a folk view or a lesson of human experience that inbreeding does not have issue.
All right, yes.
I was wondering, in the case of the minor marriages, and you were talking about they're not realizing the consequences, those three factors. When the father has to stand outside the bedroom and make sure that the son and daughter stay in there and with the cane in hand, and he knows that that they aren't enjoying it.
I didn't pay her to say that. Did anybody hear what she said?
Don't parents talk to each other and say, "Yeah, I had a all the time with my daughter too. You know what I mean? That kind of.
Look, did you hear the question? No. She is asking, you're saying that parents don't recognize and sense the consequences of minor form of marriage for fertility and divorce. But yet you give us examples of the man who sat outside the door, for 3 nights in a row to keep them from running away. And it says, implies that they do recognize the problem. And, that is true, but they don't recognize the effects on fertility and divorce rate. You see, how to put it? I mean, we're dealing, and this is where, let me make one very general point that I hope you will sort of remember going into Winter Quarter. We're dealing here fundamentally, a lot of the disagreements now between Bill and myself are coming down into the area of psychology. They're coming into the area of human cognition. They're coming into the area of, cognitive dissonance theory, the conditions under which people might doing certain kinds of things. Now, I think that is relevant here. I have no doubts whatsoever. If I asked people, why do you arrange minor marriages? And all women will wax eloquent on the great advantage of the minor form of marriage for having a daughter-in-law who will listen to what you tell her. A daughter-in-law and so forth that you can control. People are very, very much aware of where conflict arises in interpersonal relationships. They're very much aware, in a sense, of the resistance to the minor form of marriage.
But look how much more, on a small scale that is. I mean, this is a large sample, but it's a relatively small percentage of the population where you find minor marriages, and where the mother-in-law is absent and the daughter's adopted before age 1, and yet they recognize these things and value them. See, the point is, I think what she's saying, in effect, is, look, isn't there a recognition here? In fact, isn't there a recognition that the marriage isn't likely to work? That the man standing outside the door with a cane is saying, they don't know the statistics. They don't have a percentage reduction in fertility or an elevation in divorce rate, but they know there's a problem. And you're saying, and they know there's a benefit here to having a minor marriage. The mother-in-law sees a benefit. Aren't those the same kind of cognitive abilities, recognizing those subtle things, not being able to say to 3 decimal points what their value is, but recognizing those phenomena? Aren't those the same kind of things that would be of use in developing an incest taboo?
But when I ask people, if I ask people, which of these forms of marriage do you have a better mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship? Everybody has an answer. You ask people, which of these 3 forms of marriage is going to produce the most children? You don't get any answer. You get some saying one, you get some to the other, and most people sort of throwing up their hands. They are not concerned as they are about children. There is a difference in our cognitive attention that we pay to interpersonal relations of certain kind that are immediate and present and so forth in a situation, like conflict with another human being, like resistance to doing this, like, and I would argue, women's response to men who are taking a sexual interest in them that they are not interested in wanting to have. That you people cannot, human beings do recognize that. They do not recognize these longer term acts, a long time removed from the thing. We're talking about a woman's fertility. We're talking about something spread over 30 years. That is a very different kind of knowledge and cognition. And the one just doesn't speak to the other. Yes.
One point which I think would be very enlightening, which neither of you I think have dealt with that much, is what goes on in animals and in animal societies in terms of inbreeding, and what how do they function to avoid that, or do they at all?
Well, you see, I can give you a very good answer to that. If you ever see those baboons get together and deliberate,
Well, the baboons don't have an incest taboo.
they don't have an incest taboo, but they do have avoidance.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, let's just confine ourselves to the primates, and they do avoid inbreeding. Probably not perfectly, but they do avoid inbreeding.
But watch out, that's not our question here.
Yeah.
Our question is not, do we find promiscuity in nature and are humans different? The answer is we don't find promiscuity in nature, especially in mechanisms for avoiding inbreeding. But those are behavioral mechanisms. You force out your bachelor sons at reproductive maturity. Force them away. Parents just kick them out, bite them in the rump if they won't leave, and send them away. Time after time, you find some kind of mechanism for preventing inbreeding. But there is no incest taboo in those populations.
Animals are can be found in more specific spheres where they as my understanding is, don't use an intellect in a way, but have these senses and feelings more innately because they're occupying a smaller environmental sphere and niche. And as humans had a larger niche, and therefore they developed the intellect, therefore couldn't the intellect and the cognition of the incest taboo have taken over the aversion factor, which might be the more natural.
It's exactly Westermarck's argument, was that at the dawn of civilization and culture, did we not simply, through an act of self-recognition and expression, did we not simply take this thing that we all felt and begin to talk about it? If I understand you correctly. And, that's a possible argument. It is definitely a possible argument. The culture relates to biology in this case as the expression of as the expression of our human nature. It's sometimes called the handmaiden theory, because in this case, culture is the handmaiden of the genes. Culture delivers to the world what the genes order. Okay? And what even Wolf now has backed away from any evidence for that proposition. And what he's saying this morning is no longer the case that the aversion that the incest taboo represents an expressed aversion. That it is true that you can behaviorally and otherwise physiologically measure the feeling of the apes, and they do feel averse. We feel averse and can talk about it. There's no question about the aversion. The question is, does the aversion contribute in a major way to the maintenance of an incest taboo in human societies where that taboo also exists? To test your argument would be really great would be to teach Coco, for example, the gorilla, teach her a rule and say, don't go after Michael, who's being reared to mate with her, and to see if she can deal with that rule and teach the rule and so on. I mean, that would be one way you could go about it. Sorry.
Yeah, I still have a problem with going back to the Chinese. I guess because it seems to me there's a conflict between the aversion between the brothers and sisters being raised together. You have that aversion, which then leads to the social disapproval of incest. And then you have the aversion between the minor marriage couple being raised together, but there's no social disapproval of their marriage. Mm-hmm. And you seem to be saying that there are all these bad factors about the minor marriage, but that's made up for by the improved mother-in-law relationship with the daughter. I then would ask why, if you're going to base it on that, what keeps them from marrying their children together? Why don't they just raise brother and sister and marry them? Isn't it, some sort of recognition of the biological danger seems implicit in that contrast and the fact that if it's just a mother-in-law thing.
Well, way your position is very, you could survive. Here's the evidence. They will marry. Couples who are reared together who are not biologically related. They will not marry couples who are reared together and who are biologically related, so they must, in a sense, recognize the biological dangers. The difficulty with that, and you know what, it's a very well put question because it offers a nice, simple solution. The difficulties about that is no Chinese informant in 5 years of field research has ever said anything of the kind to me. Nobody. You see, this is what bothers me a lot by a lot of Bill's data. He's got one myth after another, and myths are not facts. I'm playing on words here. But I'm quite serious in that I would be much more likely to be convinced by Bill's argument if someone had gone into a society and showed me that 47% of all of the people in this society could tell you that the consequence of marrying a brother and sister would be the following. That it is recorded, curiously enough, only in mythology. Means it's very strange kind of knowledge. But at any rate, I'm quite confident that no Chinese has that recognition. Well, you can say then they must have had it in the past, they don't have it now. But why should they have had it in the past and not have it now? So you see, what I think actually happens, what I think is the answer to your question, you have a society that has a strongly formulated incest taboo, and it's formulated not only in custom, it's formulated in the Chinese case in a legal code as well. But there are real disadvantages in the sense that are created. The incest taboo creates problems for people like the Chinese. The problem of bringing in those strange women and so forth, as I have argued elsewhere. And there are great advantages of raising the girl in the family. So what they do, in a sense, is they double back. They break the spirit of the incest taboo by doing the best thing they can. They simply give away the girl, their own girls as children, and replace them with girls from the outside. In a sense, then they are observing the incest taboo, but getting the advantages that would come of marrying a brother and sister.
But if the incest taboo, you're saying it comes out of this aversion of the two siblings brought together, and then you're saying they're in spirit breaking that and bringing in a girl. Why don't they in spirit break that and have the children marry? I don't see the difference.
Well, it is mainly the difference of they're working within a situation which you already have that strongly formulated taboo in place. And look, you've got to have the authority to overcome the aversion. That didn't originally exist. The other reason probably we have minor marriages in China but no place else is that probably only in China did we have parents strong enough to enforce that kind of thing upon children who didn't want it.
Let me make a comment about the question of myth and reality. One of the reasons I included the Toraja example this morning is because I wanted you all to see that it is not simply a myth where this information is recorded. The Torajans do not give you a great founder myth. They say simply there's a physical incompatibility of types. And it's an empirically observed thing, and they talk about it. So the first point is it's not simply a myth. Second point is myth often is the closest thing we have to a real history of culture. It's not perfect. You saw that in the lactose case. You'll see it again and again, but it's as close as we're coming to having some kind of historical record, some kind of fossil sequence to understand changes that have been created in cultural systems. And therefore, yeah, I wouldn't take it too seriously. I would not have asked you to read that chapter had I not had a statistical test which did not depend at all upon the mythology of my particular argument. The third point I'd like to make is, however, closer to home. If we want to apply this thinking to our own Western incest taboo, I want to back away from the version that from the notion that my theory requires democracy, cultural democracy in action. It is not the case that everybody has to recognize it for the incest taboo to be based on a human recognition of deleterious effects. So that if we ask faithful Catholics today, why do you observe the incest prohibition of the Church? They will say, because it's part of the dogma of my faith. They may not tell you it's because of the inbreeding effects, but if you go back and look, it was Pope Gregory the Great who made it a canonical order building on the common experience of people during Roman period Egypt. I didn't mean Egypt, just during the Roman period, just in Rome. The Pope Gregory then made it an article of faith, and people today perpetuate it. But it does not require, my hypothesis does not require or propose that everybody recognizes the deleterious effects. It says that as the rule is gaining its force and momentum, that it is based on a recognition, and that quickly religions and in various ways, people will pile things onto it to make it seem more meaningful. They may even come right out and tell you, as in the Toraja case or in others, that you've got to believe this rule or you'll have deleterious effects. But that's not necessary. In the Catholic Church, I don't think they stand in the pulpit and say you must avoid mating with brother and sister because of deleterious effects. They talk about it as an article of the faithful.
Then shouldn't you find some kind of myth in every society, or at least some kind of old wives' tale or something in every society?
You should, and in fact, part of that chapter I've asked you to read is a test of, just how often is this? Because people have said, look, there's just nowhere near that level of reporting. So we went out in a world probability sample of 60 societies, found something like 40-some societies where people had told us, where the ethnographers talked enough about inbreeding and its consequences to have anything written on paper at all. And in half of those, there's a recognition of deleterious effects. That is remarkable in a discipline which is dead set against genetic consequences having anything to do with incest prohibitions, in a world in which what people put down on paper is only a small fraction of what they hear in the field, and they have to be motivated to write it down and put it in their published works and so on. I think it's a terrific percentage. It's higher percentage than supernatural sanctions against the incest taboo. And it was originally proposed that incest be defined as something supernaturally punished. So I feel pretty good about that finding. Doesn't say that we have evidence that in every single human society there is a recognition. What I can simply say is that in a majority we have a recognition.
But Bill, we have an incest taboo in every society.
Mm-hmm.
So how can it be? I mean, this is one of the very general problem that I encounter with your argument. I am saying, and maybe it's not true, but wherever we're able to test the childhood association produces an aversion hypothesis, it holds true. We haven't been able to test it in a lot of places, but wherever we, throughout, in a sense, the primate kingdom, as it were, into the childhood association for a population at large inhibits sexual attraction. This is universal. Among the Homo sapiens within the primate kingdom, we have an incest taboo in every known human society except one, the Egyptians. But we only have recognition, even by your own admissions, if I now understand you correctly, of the dangers of inbreeding in some smaller number of all human societies.
We only have a report in a majority.
So let me see now that this is true. You would argue that if we had, that the hypothesis would be rejected if we could find, some reasonably large percentage, let's say 23, of all human societies, that we could not find any substantial recognition of the dangers of inbreeding. You would give up this position.
Well, I think recognition is an important part of it. I think the real challenge, though, is in statistical tests, which don't depend. Recognition is going to depend so much on your, number one, asking the right questions in the field. Number two, bothering to write those things down or being motivated to write them down as an anthropologist. A lot of our colleagues simply have a beautiful case in the Caroline Islands, 2 islands right next door to each other with almost the same language. One ethnographer comes right out to the front and says they do not connect inbreeding and deleterious effects, and the other one gives an inbreeding argument for the evolution of the incest taboo. And these populations are about 50 miles apart on 2 different atolls. What the problem is with using the recognition as with an imperfect roster of societies as argument against the theory is that it's really imperfect recording and imperfect anthropology rather than data against the hypothesis. The ubiquitous phenomenon that we have here, every bit as universal as the aversion, is the ubiquitous phenomenon of inbreeding depression of fitness. That is every bit as universal as the phenomenon you propose. In fact, it is precedent to the phenomenon you propose, Arthur. It is obviously what gave rise to the aversion. So, in fact, we can't use these are not the way to differentiate between our 2 hypotheses. We have to test the strength of the hypotheses against real cases, not in which one is based on a universal phenomenon. They're both based on universal phenomena.
Sorry, you just plain lost me. I mean, I agree that the inbreeding depression is universal.
Great.
I agree, obviously, that childhood association inhibits sexual attraction everywhere, but not among all individuals.
Now let's talk about the incest taboo.
But don't. Let me just finish this. But doesn't your theory require that every society that has an incest taboo also has recognition of the dangers of of inbreeding. In other words, recognition of the inbreeding depression. Either that or they once had it in the past and they've forgotten about it and somehow kept the taboo. Doesn't the argument require
And in a
that?
similar fashion, doesn't your argument require that every society that has aversion between cousins have an incest taboo between those cousins? And in fact, we talked about the Lebanese case where there's a very strong aversion and no taboo, and in fact, a strong preference. See, I don't think we can proceed that way. I mean, negative cases, if anything, negative cases can throw out the aversion and taboo link. Negative cases, I'm arguing, in the question of recognition, negative cases may simply tell us we don't have enough information about that society.
But my theory allows for the aversion being overcome. I mean, the Chinese have done it.
Well, if it can be overcome among first cousins who have the, among that's in Bua, and if it can be overcome in the Lebanese case, when does it apply? If in the Lebanese case, the people who show the effect of the aversion are the preferred marriage partners, when does aversion contribute to the incest taboo?
Let's try it another way. We have the aversion produced by childhood association being overcome in China, in minor marriages, in the Bintam marriage in Egypt, in North Africa. This is probably related to the Egyptian data. It was that area of the world, the South Shore, the Mediterranean, and so forth, in which there seems to be a strong tradition of close marriages. But we have 2-3 such cases. What kind of cases are they? They are cases that are all characterized by an extreme subordination of women. They're all cases characterized by very strong parental authority, and cases in which we can point to strong practical reasons in those societies. But there are quite a limited number of cases of all known human societies. So, no one would argue that the aversion cannot be overcome, but it's rarely overcome. What I would, in a sense, offer as the challenge is the lack of knowledge of the dangers of inbreeding, as rare as it is.
Well, I would just offer that empirically it would seem to be a small proportion of societies where at the moment the record does not indicate some recognition of inbreeding's harmful effects. So I think we're on very similar empirical grounds, and I don't think that's going to decide between the cases.
Yes, we have a question back.
Professor Williams, so your main argument is that you don't believe that recognition has anything to do with the incest taboos. And if that is so, you take the Chinese and say they don't recognize that the minor marriages produce fewer children, they have a higher divorce rate, et cetera, well, don't you think that deleterious effects are more manifest in physical, so people recognize them more than a long-term marriage or children way off down the road? Don't you think people recognize more that their child is dying or that it's malformed?
They recognize, they certainly recognize albinism and those things. What I'm saying that they don't do is they don't link it to the fact that those parents are biologically related in a certain way.
But Professor Durham has shown us evidence where they do in those societies.
Even
Well-
when there's an alibi, like in the Taraja case, to give people an out, even when they say, well, I had an albino, but it's because of the spirit, the chiefs all know that it's because she's had sex with a prohibited relative.
Let me just make one last remark, not in the spirit of the debate, but in the spirit of what I want partly to see you get out of this. The issue, I think, as it's now formulated, is one of, to put it in very general terms, my position is, in a sense, much more pessimistic than Bill's. I do not credit the possibility that results that we need to express in a quantitative fashion are recognized by most human beings under most situations. And I don't credit the possibility that recognizing those dangers, people would institute an incest taboo just to avoid those problems. I want to derive that taboo from some other, more automatic, in a sense, principles based in another kind in human psychology. So in a sense, there's a, to put it in the most general terms, the fundamental disagreement, I think, between Bill and myself is how rational and how disciplined are human beings. And he has a much more optimistic view in that respect than I do. Okay.
Bill, question.
Yes.